Good afternoon. I'm Peter Beard, and I lead Greater Houston Partnership's UpSkill Houston initiative, which is an employer-led effort that focuses on creating a collaboration of employers, education leaders, and community-based leaders to really build the skilled talent pipeline here in the Houston region. And we know it takes kind of a team to be able to do that, and that's the purpose of UpSkill Houston, is really to bring those folks together. And our focus is really on the middle skill occupations. Those are the occupations that require education and skills beyond high school, but less than 4 years of college. And today I'd like to welcome our virtual audience, excuse me, to a special hybrid UpSkill Houston Works Forum, which brings together kind of critical state leaders, such as our special guest today, who champions kind of building the skilled workforce for the Texas Gulf Coast region and the state of Texas, Dr. Harrison Keller. He's the Commissioner for Higher Education, and I'll do a longer introduction in a brief minute. But I'd also like to thank our in-person audience. All of you are important critical leaders here in Houston that are champions for education and workforce, and we're excited to have you here with us today. Before I introduce the Commissioner, I also want to thank our sponsors, because our sponsors make this opportunity available, and they also continue to advance and champion education and workforce here in Houston. Accenture, Houston Community College, Texas Mutual Insurance, Winstead PC, Burns and McDonald, Lone Star College, Mustang Cat, San Jacinto College, Silver Eagle Distributors Houston, Worley, HCA Houston Healthcare, and Ineos Olefins and Polymers. The partnership really appreciates your support, because without it, we wouldn't be able to do these things and the work that we do at UpSkill Houston. For our virtual audience, we are streaming through the partnership's website, and you can submit questions by use of the Mentimeter application, which I think you were introduced to, and we'll also be conducting some live polls to do that. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Harrison Keller, who serves as the 6th Commissioner for Higher Education and leads the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Prior to his appointment as Commissioner, Dr. Keller served as Deputy to the President for Strategy and Policy and a Professor of Practice at University of Texas at Austin. We could look at his CV and it would go on and on and on, but he has a very distinguished career and is recognized as an innovator in policy and programs, particularly around how to improve college readiness and student success, particularly for low-income students and first-generation students. In fact, I met Dr. Keller through our work together with Texas OnCourse, which is really a critical program for improving secondary school advising and career counseling. Commissioner Keller, welcome here to Houston and the Greater Houston Houston Partnership.
Yeah, thanks. I so appreciate the opportunity to be here with y'all today. So actually, when I took this job as commissioner nearly 3 years ago, my first trip was down to Houston, including a great meeting here at GHB. And you can see on my photo as the way in what I looked like pre-pandemic when I came down for that meeting. And I thought I knew what job I was getting into. And then about 4 or 5 months into the job, of course, COVID hit. And then it's been very different than I thought, and for all of us, than we thought these last couple of years would be.
You know, and we're really excited to be here. And one of the topics we're going to be talking about is credentials of value. But as I was looking at your CV, I noticed that you have a bachelor's in philosophy from Notre Dame, a master's and PhD in philosophy from Georgetown, and that's what it takes to get to be commissioner?
Well, it's a pretty kind of stereotypical story for a boy from the Texas Panhandle, I guess, to go into academic philosophy. But and it's hard to pass up the money, of course. But so I got interested in philosophy because I was interested in Texas politics and policymaking. I was interested in questions about what it should mean to treat people with respect, and what it should look like so that we have equitable opportunities for people to lead good lives, to flourish. And so as Commissioner of Higher Education, I have this unique privilege that I get up every morning and work on these questions. So for me, my training in philosophy was actually excellent preparation for the kind of work that I do every day.
I took a lot of philosophy, so I totally understand. But the other thing I noted in the CV, and this is really just to acknowledge your service and thank you for it, was a lieutenant in the Naval Reserve. So thank you for that. I found that an interesting little piece of information about your background, which is very interesting and distinguished. But recently, the coordinating board released its Building Talent Strong Texas, which is really this new strategic plan that really needs to address the fact that not only Houston, but the state is moving to an innovation-based, technology-enabled economy. And I was wondering if you could kind of share how you approach that and what the kind of key highlights of that plan is.
So we're very excited about this new state strategic plan. So one of the statutory charges for the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board is to develop and advance the state strategic plan for higher education. So the previous plan was called 60 by 30 Texas, and our new plan is called Building a Talent Strong Texas. And so number one, I want to say thank you to GHP, to institutions represented here in this room, to employers, because how we approached it, it was first engaging hundreds of key stakeholders across the state. So we heard from community leaders, we heard from K-12 leaders, higher education leaders, employers, and the focus of these conversations was what does Texas need now from higher education? I'm really proud of the plan that's emerged, the Building Talent Strong Texas plan. So there's 4 key pillars to that plan that are different from what we had before. So first, our previous plan was primarily focused on our young working population. So the population that would be age 25 to 34 in the year 2030. So that's why the plan was called 60 by 30, but to have a 60% attainment goal for that young working population. So first, we broadened the age of the target and the plan. So yes, we want to work on educational attainment for the 25 to 34-year-olds, but also for the 35 to 64-year-olds. So we've set a new attainment goal for 60% for essentially our whole working age population. To recognize that there's so many people that we're going to need to reskill and upskill, to re-engage, who are going to need training and credentials in today's economy. Second, we also broadened the range of the kinds of credentials that were included in the plan. So traditional degrees, certificates, but also short-term workforce credentials, could even be skilled trade apprenticeships, but with an important caveat. And that's that, as Peter alluded to, we want to make sure that those credentials are credentials of value. And in this context, what we mean is of value to individuals if we look at the typical earnings that are associated with those credentials in our Texas labor market, even accounting for the cost of earning those credentials. So are you better off for earning that credential? Texas is the first state to condition our goals for production of post-secondary credentials on the wage premiums, so we have a market-driven plan, and we would say these credentials are of value because Texas employers value them. Associated with that also is keeping a closer eye on student debt, and we set a target that by 2030, 95% of our students should be able to complete undergraduate credentials either with no debt at all or debt that would be manageable given that wage premium, given the kind of credential that they're earning, which is an ambitious goal but provides a much clearer direction for us in advising. And then we have a new goal on research, development, and innovation, because that's going to be critical for the state to be competitive into the future. I know it's something high on the radar screen in the policy discussions here in Greater Houston. And then finally, we have to renew our commitment to equity. So over this last decade, Texas added more residents than any other state. So we added nearly 4 million new Texans over this last decade. 95% of that growth was in communities of color. So if we don't advance our goals equitably and make sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate in, contribute to, benefit from our state economy, we just cannot hit our goals. So again, I'm very excited about the plan, and we can talk more about it, but we're already working on operationalizing that plan, working with institutions on, like, for example, just before we started, seed grants to institutions to accelerate the work they're doing on short-term credentials that are aligned with workforce needs. We've got exciting work in the policy arena that's happening right now in community college finance. Many of the folks who are in the room are also actively involved in that. So the Talent Strong Texas Plan gives us a much clearer vision that's aligned with what we heard from our employers, what we heard from Texans about what they need from our colleges and universities. We're really appreciative of the partnership and looking forward to this work ahead.
I want to tease out one little piece to that conversation, which is this credentials of value. And, UpSkill Houston has tried to be employer-led, and that's where I think, we as employers in the business community are going to need to probably step up and lean in a little more than we have in the past. So what are your thoughts on that? Because that becomes critical, because that's, the business validates the credential.
Yeah, so part of what's ambitious about the Texas plan that you don't see in any other state right now is this idea that we need a plan that's market driven. So we're not, like our original 60 by 30 Texas plan just said we need more degrees and credentials, whatever those degrees and certificates are. Now we're saying we need more degrees, certificates, short-term credentials, other kinds of credentials, micro-credentials, but they need to translate into value for individuals. They need to be aligned with workforce needs, and the way we validate it is pretty straightforward because we have incredibly rich data in Texas. Actually, the coordinating board by statute is the steward of the state's combined educational and workforce data infrastructure. So we can merge the data, look at how students progress in their educational pipeline, and what the earnings trajectory looks like. And so we'll be working with the institutions to leverage that data and reflect back to the institutions as an input into their discussions. There's some great examples just represented here in the room of what Lone Star does, what Sanjak does, where they've been leveraging that kind of labor market information for years. The idea is all of our colleges and universities need to leverage that kind of information so that we can improve that alignment with what our workforce needs look like.
And I also want to credit your leadership, because during the pandemic, when we had the GEARS funding and TRUE being administered, you provided the ability for all of the community colleges in partnership with the Brookings Institution with labor market data that could help them find those high growth occupations, correct?
Yeah, so this was, there were a lot of things that early on in the pandemic we're trying to figure out how do we get dollars out there in ways that are going to be especially impactful. This is one of the things we're especially proud of. So we worked in consultation with the institutions and in close partnership with the Texas Workforce Commission and with Brookings Institution, just put a little tool together so that by region, colleges could see, here are the occupations where folks have lost jobs, here are the occupations absorbing folks who have lost jobs, what kind of occupations are projected to grow over time, that kind of basic information to help inform their decisions about how they were using federal funds, how they were using grant funds from the coordinating board. And that was just a first step to this much larger work that we have underway right now to be able to make our data more useful and accessible.
So let's turn to that first population, because as you know, in Houston, our educational outcomes aren't where they probably ought to be if we're going to continue to grow the economy, which is, through the Kinder Institute and the research they've done, the longitudinal studies is 20% or 1 in 5 students, end up with some sort of post-secondary degree. And if you widen that aperture for 12 years out, it goes to 30%, which, given a labor market that requires probably 30 to 35% requiring bachelor's and above, and another 30 to 35% some sort of in the middle skill space, that feels problematic.
Yeah, and across the state, so the most recent projections from the Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce is that we'll have more than 60% of our jobs in Texas by 2030 are going to require some kind of education beyond high school. And we do have a serious gap there. The Workforce Commission estimates that somewhere between 600 and 800,000 jobs across the state that we're not able to fill right now because we don't have folks who've got the post-secondary training and credentials that they need. So that not necessarily a bachelor's degree or even a certificate, that can be other kinds of workforce credentials. And just to be candid, as a state, over decades, that wasn't something that was prioritized and invested in. So as we're working on, for example, the community college finance system, you can see how aligning incentives for, say, academic dual credit programs drove incredible growth in our dual credit programs over 2 decades. So we went from maybe 10,000 students who were enrolled in college while they were enrolled in high school in the year 2000 to nearly 200,000 students across the state a couple of decades later. And that's because of great work by the institutions, but also where we've aligned the incentive and gotten behind those institutions. We never did that on the workforce education side for the community colleges. So over the last decade, what that meant is even as we added nearly 4 million Texans and our economy is moving faster than anybody anticipated in needing additional skills, additional credentials, the workforce education enrollments in our community colleges actually declined over a decade. So there's an urgency here where we've got to, we need to focus our resources, clear regulatory brush, get behind the innovators, and we've got to accelerate the pace of innovation, especially around workforce education, to meet these needs so that the talent pipeline is going to be there.
And that would include, in many cases, some of the innovations we're seeing here in Houston, where the community colleges and the school districts are partnering in kind of pre-apprenticeship and other things, much more in the workforce dimension than the pure academic transfer.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about credentials of value, so here's how we were talking about it within, we're part of the governor's tri-agency workforce initiative, so I work very closely with Mike Morath from Texas Education Agency and Texas Workforce Commission, especially Brian Daniel, the chairman of the Workforce Commission. So if you think about, like, here's all of the credentials that are awarded by different kinds of providers, higher education institutions and other providers in Texas. So the Workforce Commission is standing up a state credential repository to capture that whole universe. Where the coordinating board, where we put the marker down with our policymakers and our employers, is to say, now let's focus on what's the subset that are the credentials of value, including credentials that are in high demand. There are going to be some of those that can also be delivered in high schools. So it can be delivered in the P-TECH programs or dual credit programs. And so where we're headed is we want the language, the analyses, the criteria, like the list of industry recognized certifications, all that kind of thing, to be consistent across what we talk about in our workforce solutions regions, what we talk about in our higher education institutions, and also in our K-12 schools and our high schools.
So before I get to the next question, I want Harrison to know kind of who's in the audience, and this is both for the in-person and audience that's watching remotely. I wanted to give the commissioner a sense of who's actually attended or received education from a community college. So if you go to your Mentimeter, there should be a polling question, and wanted to give a sense of how many of us have had some experience with a community college from an educational perspective. And since I can't participate in the poll, I can share with you, Commissioner, that when I was in high school, I took courses at Montgomery County Community College in Maryland, partly because I wanted to strengthen kind of my grammar in English composition and writing skills. And so while I was getting that in the high school, really wanted to take, a much more deeper push into that. So that was my experience, and it was a good experience.
Yeah. That would have been good for me. We didn't have, in Plainview when I came through, we didn't have dual credit, we didn't have AP, and the South Plains College was a ways away from my hometown. So that would have been great. I would have helped ease my own transition into higher education.
So what am I seeing? I can't quite see the. What is the orange?
Half taken a credit or non-credit course at community college has 27, so that's over half.
So over half have had some sort of experience. Anyone get an associate's degree? I knew one of the community college presidents had been.
And there's Terry over there. Yeah, you know, if we had an audience that was current college students, it would be way, way higher. So even like you go to our research universities and you'd see more than 70% of students have taken courses from community colleges. And so that's an example of where I think, like when we've talked about how many students are transfer students or not, if you focus on traditional transfer students, it's a much smaller subset. But if we focus on how many students have benefited from community colleges, it's actually the vast majority of our students have participated in and benefited from our community colleges.
And that's kind of why I wanted to do it, because I knew there's a story for us to be telling about the important role community colleges play and why we should think about them as more as kind of critical and indispensable institutions. I now want to shift to that much tougher population, and it's one that keeps me up at night in particular, and that's this 35 to 64. And I somewhat play by the numbers, Commissioner. One is when you think about here in the Houston region, there are probably 3.2 million people employed across kind of the 12, 13 county region. And based on kind of national data, we can expect that somewhere between 45 and 50% of that workforce are in low-wage jobs. And given the trends with technology and automation and other things, that's well over 1 million people, 1.5 million, that we need to be thinking about upskilling and reskilling.
Yep.
And we've got to find occupational pathways and pathways to do that, because at the end of the day, when we think about how an economy in our region grows or in Texas grows, there are only two ways to do it, and you hinted at one, which is increase the population and or increase the productivity, which then gets driven by upskilling or reskilling individuals or the use of technology. And we know that the tax code favors the technology piece of this, and we need to find ways to actually, from an equitable perspective, grow that low-wage workforce into better jobs and better pathways.
Yeah, and some of the statistics you're citing there track also with what we've been seeing. So if we estimate there are nearly 4 million Texans who've got some college but no post-secondary credential. We think there are approximately 1 million in Greater Houston. And so, of course, our economy has been growing in the direction of higher skills and more credentials faster than anyone anticipated. And if anything, we have this growing disconnect between those kind of urgent needs and then what the institutions and the underlying policy context were designed to achieve. So, the working age adults, incumbent workers as part of that are incredibly challenging population to reach. And I haven't met any community college or technical college leader who feels like they've just got that nailed. So I think everyone is trying to figure out what the right approach is, what the right strategies are. Historically, though, I can tell you some of the things that we did that did not work as well. So historically, what we've tended to do is sort of punt it back to individual colleges to find those adult learners or folks who've stopped out and re-enroll them. And that doesn't generally work very effectively. So one of the lessons that we've learned, including through pilots working in partnership with Houston area community colleges and the Greater Houston Partnership, is we need more of a regional outreach. We need more coordinated marketing and outreach. So later this year, we're actually going to be rolling out one stop that we're calling My Texas Future, where we can curate different advising resources. And the first population that we're prioritizing are these adult learners. So we need to have one place we can drive traffic that folks can find and explore the programs that are available, start to develop a plan, and then we can help engineer a warm handoff to institutions that have programs that would be a good fit for them. So one piece of that we're working on, and we need to continue to accelerate our efforts, is on student advising. The next thing, though, is on the design of the programs themselves. We just don't have enough seats right now in the kinds of programs that we need to meet the kind of workforce needs that we already have in the direction the economy is moving. So we have been able to focus some funding because of strategic investments by the governor and legislative leadership on seed capital for the institutions. That's a good start. But we're going to need to make sure the recurring funding is there for both for the startup costs and also for the operation of those kind of programs, and that's going to be an important part of the conversation going forward. And then there's also what kind of support services students are going to need. The adult population have different kinds of needs. We did some polling of our Texans with some college and no credential. We oversampled in Houston. And one of the things that was surprising to me is issues around advising were as much a barrier as issues around cost. So yes, those supports need to include financial aid, but they need to include advising. There were questions about, would my credits transfer? Could I find a flexible program that would enable me to work while I was pursuing a program? For some folks, childcare ends up being the critical barrier to them being able to re-enroll and be able to advance. And then one of the fundamental questions was, even when folks said, I understand that I might need more education and training if I lost my job or to get a better job, they weren't sure what that connection was. And so we need a much clearer line of sight between here are the kind of programs that are available and how that leads not only to earning a credential, but here are the kinds of jobs and the kind of career paths that those credentials open up to you.
No, and I think that's critical as we particularly think about where you started on the importance of the equity and inclusion issues that are going to show up in this space. And in addition to kind of this line of sight in career advising and the wraparound supports, there's a question that came in around, kind of the literacy skills. And I know many of the community colleges play a critical role in providing adult literacy. And I mean, could we just delve into that briefly to kind of go a little bit deeper in terms of kind of this equity and inclusion, because that's the underlying theme to some of this.
Yeah, so I don't think folks appreciate the breadth of the mission of the community colleges in general. And I'll tell you, the one time that I ran for office, I ran for the Austin Community College Board of Trustees. I lost, but it was a great education for me, and really opened my eyes to the breadth of the kinds of offerings, because the community colleges, they have ESL programs, they have, some of them have high school equivalency and completion programs, of course, all the continuing education workforce programs, transfer programs. It's really sort of the safety net of American higher education that plays this essential role across so many different fronts. We have experienced, trauma in our educational pipeline on a scale I think it's important for us to acknowledge. This was the greatest disruption for our colleges and universities to their operations since the Second World War. Our community college enrollments are still down. We think about 90,000 students from where they were just before the pandemic. If you look at our broad access broad access universities, they're down another 10,000 students. We've lost more than 120,000 students from our K-12 schools. So we have nearly 250,000 Texans that are not in the educational pipeline now who were pre-pandemic. Now, we think the vast majority of them are working. A lot of them are working in entry-level positions that are relatively low wage, low mobility kind of positions. So where labor market participation, let's all stipulate, is a good thing. When students are trading the short-term gains for those long-term opportunities, that creates a vulnerability for the students, for our communities, for our state as a whole. So, when we talk about this and we talk about the learning loss, the learning loss that we've experienced with our high school students and with our students in higher education, that's going to come right back into the laps of our community colleges. And that's going to be over several years. So already when I've talked to some of the presidents and chancellors in the room, they've told me they're already seeing spiking demand for remediation as folks have been out for a while and they need to get back up to speed. There's also spiking demand for mental health services because of the scale of the trauma that students experience, which right now I'll say our colleges don't receive additional state funding for any of those kinds of support services they have to provide. So I think it's going to be important to understand, not to explain away the problems and the challenges, but so that we can illustrate, here's the urgency of the moment, and here's how we need to focus resources, focus our policy conversations, so we can meet the challenge head on. Right, particularly in our community colleges.
So there's some questions here, and we'll also open it up here in the room. And there seems to be a general theme in a couple of the questions related to how businesses are engaging or not engaging with colleges, and the importance of that, partly because it gets to projecting labor market demand and kind of the skills and credentials. And so it feels like we need, once again, as the business community and as the partnership, we need to lean into it more. But how are you thinking about what role businesses and community colleges should play, and how do we strengthen the partnership that's there?
Yeah, so here are a couple important lessons that we learned so again, Texas is one of a few states where the governor and legislative leadership prioritized higher education for more discretionary stimulus funds through the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, and entrusted more than $360 million that we've been able to use to accelerate the TRUE initiative, be able to accelerate some of the innovative efforts on campuses, support students and student financial aid, those kinds of things. Here's two important lessons, though, that I'd want to highlight. One is back to our discussion about the use of data. So when we created that tool with the Brookings Institution and Workforce Commission, and we put that data out there, so there were some institutions, some of whom are represented in this room, who look at that kind of data routinely. They might have, I don't know, Lone Star probably has half a dozen, maybe a dozen analysts who work with labor market data all the time. We have 22 community colleges who have 5,000 students or fewer. And so there were a lot of our colleges across the state that said, we've never seen this kind of data. We never looked at this kind of data. That was really eye-opening to us. First, just to make sure the information is available in a way that folks can readily consume. Okay. The other important lesson is then when we're making these investments in the programs, it's critical to have the employers at the table, and at the table from the get-go. One of the mistakes we've made in the past is just say you provide different kinds of grants directly to institutions, and then you say the institutions, work on a program that's going to be aligned with your workforce needs. Well, I know that if I call up Houston Community College, they have programs and partnerships that they can leverage and scale based on the work that's already being done in partnership with employers, right? But again, there's capacity there in the larger colleges to have that ongoing engagement that we don't have across the state and across all the colleges. So it's going to be important for us to build support structures for our smaller colleges and encourage and maybe even require stronger partnerships with the business community, because we want to make sure that we don't just do more credentials. We can make up credentials and claim that we're making great progress. We want to make sure that we're aligned with what our current and emerging workforce needs are like. And to do that, we're going to have to sort of reset the baseline across all of our colleges so that we've got a broader ability to do that.
And for those in the room, if you have a question, you can raise your hand and we'll come over and get ready for it. But on this credentials of value, I know one of the credentials that you're intrigued with is, the credentials that come out from Grow with Google. Partly because there is this kind of linkage between the employer
Yeah.
and the institution or the development of the credential. And one of the questions is related to how do we begin to integrate some of those that may not have us started on the academic side of kind of colleges and bring them into that world. So I know you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, and one of the things, and you alluded to it, Peter, that I like about the way that the Grow with Google career credentials were put together, and other kinds of credentials that are available through they're part of the larger Coursera Career Academy, is that they've done this validation with multiple employers. So Google put together certificates in data analytics and IT support and UI UX design and project management. And so they spent a lot of time trying to figure out what are the skills that you need to be able to do those jobs at Google, but then they validated them with other employers. So other employers shared their assessments and they shared their evaluations of what they needed. And there's this ongoing discussion and validation process. So that by itself is really, really interesting. Actually, I have a high school age son, and he's doing the project management course as we speak. I hope he's doing the project management course as we speak. I think he's a little behind right now, but he's taken what he's learning there, and he's started his own little business where he's using that as part of his detailing business that he's put together in Austin. But the other thing that Google's done is originally when folks were putting out these like Amazon and Google certificates, there was a lot of enthusiasm about, oh, here's this alternative to higher education. That's not the way it's evolving. The way it's evolving is in a different direction where we see more and more institutions actually incorporating these into their programs, leveraging that work that's already been done. So maybe it's the Google data analytics career certificate along with some additional courses or experiences or internships as part of a health informatics program, for example, which is one of the ways Johns Hopkins has leveraged that information. Or leveraged that. We also see growing number of institutions awarding credit for those kinds of experiences. And I know a number of the colleges, even represented here, have worked hard on how they convert non-credit workforce education offerings, how you incorporate those into a credit-bearing program so that you start out in a non-credit program, you earn a credential, at some point that's convertible into something that stacks to another credential. That's really hard work to do well. And it requires close partnership with the employers to understand the career trajectories, to understand what the skills look like. But the payoff for the employers, the payoff for the students is really transformative.
So there's another question in the stream here, and it kind of comes back to this some college, no degree. And it really kind of is focused on how can employers partner differently with the community colleges in many respects, based on the survey that you were talking about, to make it more user-friendly for the individual to get the degree that could help them make the progression. Partly because it feels like we need to have the conversations you were just referencing about what's the progression and what's the next mile of skills development and how can it be delivered in a user-friendly way or a convenient way for someone who's already working, trying to go to school, trying to figure out how to go to school. And do you have thoughts about some of the innovations related to that? Because I think that gets to some of the, once again, the equity issues we confront.
Yeah, absolutely. So, because historically, what you got is more kind of unproductive finger pointing. So, like, higher ed would say, well, we would do better if K-12 sent us better students, and then the employers would say, well, we would do better if you sent us better trained graduates. But that doesn't really get you anywhere. I mean, what ends up being really important is when you have those close partnerships among K-12 and the higher education institutions and the employers, so you understand here's what the skills are, here's how we need to build those skills over time. So for example, like one of the critical areas where we know we have a shortage across the state is around data analytics and data science. And I've talked to a number of employers who said students are learning the wrong math, right? We were still way too algebra based, even in the ways that we're innovating our remedial education. We've got still too much of a forced march to algebra. What we really need is more statistics. We need people who can work with data. We need people who can consume data, people who can visualize data in ways that are going to turn data into actionable intelligence. But that's the kind of information that you need at a high level, but then to break it down into, okay, well, what does that application look like? So you get a sense of how the program can be tailored in ways that translate directly into somebody being able to earn a credential that translates into a better job and a career path from day one.
And that raises a different question, and I'm not sure you can answer it. It's more on my side of the table than it is on your side of the table, which is if we've worked together as employers to help create these credentials, how do we get rewarded and incented, or how do we actually use them in a way that actually hires folks? Because there's this disconnect. And so I think once again it comes back to, as many of the colleges have done here in the room, partnered very directly with employers to get the brutal, honest feedback to create the programs that would allow them to go like, I have confidence. And I know you can't answer that, but it goes to our point of why employer leadership is critical to do this, to prevent this idea of, well, I got the credential and someone said it was valued, and how do I get hired by an employer and acknowledged for taking that kind of work? And it takes a stronger partnership than we have. And that's part of what I think our task at UpSkill Houston and the Greater Houston Partnership and our business partners to do that. Because I think we have to answer that question and not just subject the colleges and the high schools and others with, well, we trained them with something we thought was right. What do we need to do to make it better to make that connection?
Well, and something that there's been some discussion about, and there's a lot of anecdotes about, but I think to be able to capture a little more systematically, like even within Greater Houston, like what we know a lot more about the costs of remediation from high school to college than we do about remediation from our high schools and colleges into the workforce. But there are real costs that are associated with that, and there are real productivity gains that to be had if we can streamline these pathways for students. That should be something that we can make more tangible and make a better argument in the policy arena too.
And I think that's right, because I think from an employer's perspective, they want a qualified applicant pool that has the skills ready to be hired. They want folks that can get to full productivity as quickly as possible, and then how do they grow and retain them? And then we, coming back to the low wage, issue of folks that are already in the workforce, those folks have already figured out how to show up in our workplace, figured out how to navigate the transportation and childcare, and yet we haven't figured out how to upskill and reskill them, because we're going to have to do that in order to, one, continue to increase our economy. So I think it's going to require that partnership and a deeper partnership than we've had before, and it's really going to be incumbent for all of us to kind of like, let's sit in the room and really get into the fight. And I don't want to put it in the kind of fighting ring, but we've got to get really tough and have the tough conversations so that we can actually build that. And then how do we actually think as employers, what do we need to be doing to partner differently? And here in Houston, we've had the opportunity with Accenture and Aon to really think about how do we use apprenticeship and apprentices as a different model that allows you to kind of customize the education and training to do exactly what you're doing, which is get them to full productivity in the most efficient, cost-effective way.
Which is, that is an area in particular where, in partnership with the Workforce Commission, like we have been focusing resources. So work-based learning, apprenticeships, and internships can be one of the best and most cost-effective ways for us to ensure that alignment is there.
And so, in many respects, we want to kind of double down on that, and I'm going to have to acknowledge my good friend Mary Beth Gracie from Accenture, who's the managing partner and head of office here in Houston, for the leadership she and her team have done to really, how do we have this conversation to think differently about the roles beyond the crafts and trades that we're so used to seeing into areas like business services, IT, finance, HR. And so we're excited by that, and we expect that work to scale, but it's going to require, once again, the employers and the colleges to figure out the flexibility that allows for folks to go to work, get paid, and also get their education at the same time. So, before I get to kind of the final thing, are there any questions here in the audience? Yeah. Hold on a sec, so Mike can come over to you.
Thank you. Andrew Van Chow, Fulshire Katy area Chamber and EDCs. Completely right conversation to have, particularly from the employer perspective. What I get to, though, when I think about that is that we all know that the largest amount of people are employed by small and medium-sized companies. And oftentimes, those are not the companies that are involved in a lot of these apprenticeship programs and all these initiatives because they don't have the resources, the people to send to participate in those. So it goes back to one of the points that Peter brought up, which is around how do you incentivize this beyond what we are currently doing to have more of those partners around the table, the employer partners, so that we can, have more opportunities for entry level and more, paid work experience.
Yeah. So this is an important part. So you want to make sure that the small and medium-sized businesses are able to first can piggyback on some of these efforts effectively, and also there's more opportunities for direct participation. So on the second one in particular, that's one of the lessons we've learned. And so when we're putting seed capital out there, that we need to have much more visible partnerships with employers, where employers are at the table from the beginning, because that's not always happened, and so that's one of the best ways that we can make sure that the program is going to meet the needs of businesses is for businesses to be in part of the conversation early. On the second one, that first more general thing about the small businesses being able to piggyback on the programs, that's where I think having this more visible commitment around credentials of value is going to be important. It's because we want to make sure that these credentials have a currency, so that if you're hiring somebody and they've got say a micro credential in sales or in data analytics, or whatever that area is, that you've got some sense that was that credential reflects a set of skills that are valued by Texas employers that translates into value for the individual and for the employers. So again, that's why I'm really enthusiastic about this kind of more market-driven direction. Where we've put this ambitious marker down that we don't just want to create credentials. We want to make sure they're credentials of value.
And I think to follow up on that, Andrew, I think, as much as we've talked about how does business and education partner differently for the student worker learner, in that I think we as a business community obviously have to think about what kind of capacity should we be providing in light of that, which is, the same issue, which is you can't hire a full HR staff the same way that Chevron can. And how do we help support them in making those connections and finding ways to almost do business development with the small and mid-sized businesses that really don't have that capacity. And so I think that's another role that as UpSkill Houston thinks about its kind of next phase coming out of the pandemic, how do we support that, given to your point, most folks are employed by small and mid-sized businesses. Mm-hmm. Any other questions here?
Commissioner, thank you for being here today and giving us this opportunity. My question is a policy / just something to put on the radar for the future. We talk a lot about the impact that developmental education has as a barrier towards Texans in terms of achieving their goals. There are states that allow for the use of developmental education in dual enrollment programs. And I think that that's something that as we think about the future, we've got them for 4 years in those high schools, and the success rates are higher in those dual enrollment places. But we don't have any of the incentives to work on some of those strategies while we have them in high school, because a lot of the college dreams go there to die. So just wondering what your thoughts were about Dev Ed and dual enrollment as it relates to future planning.
Yeah, and I'm increasingly skeptical of standalone remediation, whether that happens in the high school or happens in the colleges. And based on what we're seeing and what we've and what I've heard from actually some of the institutions right here, is I think the right direction is more around co-requisite remediation. So what I've been an advocate for is lowering barriers to entry for dual credit programs, but not to gloss over issues where students or areas where students might need to be remediated, but doing more what we call co-requisite remediation, where we're incorporating the remediation in there. So generally, like, being college ready or not isn't like being pregnant, right? It's not like you're college ready or you're not college ready. Like, you can be college ready for some things and not for other things. And even within, say, a math course, maybe you need to brush up on your exponentials and logarithms, but you're good on your basic arithmetic or something like that. So what the idea is tailor those supports more to where students need them, so that students are able to take advantage of, say, dual credit opportunities while they're in high school. Not only fill in those gaps so they're college ready, but they're actually earning a college credit, and they're earning a college credit that can apply to their degree program. So that's where I'd come out on that. Is I know there's a school of thought that says, let's still do remediation, but let's do standalone remediation courses, and we'll do those in high schools. I'd rather just bypass that and say, look, let's lean into what's working with our dual credit programs right now, but also resource where we can do that co-requisite remediation. So where students need support, let's give them support, but let's give them the opportunity to participate in these courses.
And so before we take the final question, I know that United Way and Amanda and the good work that she's doing with United Way of Greater Houston is bringing the same concept to much of their work with the ALICE population, which is how do we do contextualized learning to get them ready so that they can actually show up in the workplace. And I know there's been some really good work, particularly on the healthcare side, to do contextualized learning so that folks can get into the healthcare workforce. Really quick question, and then we'll kind of begin to close out.
Commissioner, this is David Johnston from Houston Independent School District, and I oversee our college, career, and military readiness work. And I really appreciated your comments around the need for us to look at our curriculum and making sure that our curriculum is driving with the workforce. I also wanted just to hear your thoughts around the work with TEA. We looked at why are so many of HISD students not college ready? And one of the things we found was that so much of our curriculum in our lower high school grade levels is so STAR driven. And when we actually we did a crosswalk to look at what is on the TSI test, and there was like some very different skills that we were needing for students to have in order to be successful on STAR, but we weren't seeing those for the TSI. So a lot of our teachers get very sort of tunneled into teaching for the test that determines right their school's rating at the end of the year. So I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so first, let me say Mike Morath's been a great partner for me in this role. We've got a very good relationship and work very well together. And I think if Mike were up here, he would probably be one of the first people to say, yeah, we've got a lot of work to do on that front. So one of the places you see disconnections across states is, where the K-12 sort of wants to say to higher education, well, we'll tell you what college readiness is. So, and one of the things I appreciate about Mike and the directions we've been going in is more, it's a different direction. So it's more saying, look, there's an empirical question about what students need to be ready in college, right? And that's what we were talking about right here when we were talking about the dual credit courses. Like, what kind of support do students need to be able to navigate the next thing? And not just because we say so, we got a committee in a hotel conference room and said, well, wouldn't it be great if students did these things? But because we actually look where students get hung up in their pathways. So we do have more work to do to get better alignment. Honestly, I think our best tool in the toolbox there is going to be around these dual credit and dual enrollment programs. So we need to engage our talented students earlier in the pipeline so they're both checking the boxes for their high school requirements and making progress in their higher education programs with courses that will transfer to any college or public college or university. So so I think that's a strategy that we need to continue to lean into. And I will say again, I appreciate that the perspective that TEA has taken on this. I think we are committed across the agencies to trying to tighten up that alignment, but where it's more dialed into what students really need to be successful at the next level.
So as we close out, I have a couple things I'm going to put on the table for you, but we're going to do one last poll, and this is really kind of the Uber feedback to us, but how important is the workforce mission of the community college? You should see that on your Mentimeter. I know it's a little biased the way I structured it. I'm sure my PhD dissertation would go like, you didn't ask the question in the right way. But. So as people are doing that, Commissioner, I'm going to put three kind of broad questions on the table. We can close it out. Why are community colleges the key institution for addressing the skills gap in Texas? What are your thoughts for employers and business leaders about how they can support the workforce mission of the community colleges? And then I know you're going to be operationalizing the Building Talent Strong Texas, but there must be things in the longer term horizon that keep you up at night like they keep me up at night. So I'd just be interested as we close out this, what that is.
So, okay, so so the first one was about the community colleges.
The importance, yeah.
I mean, so the community colleges have the scale and we have existing infrastructure there that we need to leverage, build on, strengthen, so that we can take on the challenges that are large-scale challenges. I mean, there are lots of interesting things that are happening around the margins, but if we're really serious about impact at scale, then we have to look at where we're going to have capabilities to have that impact, and a lot of that's going to be through bolstering our community colleges, especially in their workforce education mission. Now, from employers, though, we need a different kind of engagement, as you alluded to, where it's more granular, a better sense of like, well, what are those kinds of tasks? What kind of math are we talking about? And even like where are folks getting hung up in their career pathways? So we can feed that information back into the design of programs for our colleges and our universities. The thing that most keeps me up at night is that I feel, so you sort of zoom out and you look at sort of the history of American higher education, there have been these different times when the workforce needs have changed really, really rapidly, and there's this disconnect with what our higher education institutions are designed to do. So you see that in the Industrial Revolution and right around and immediately after the Civil War. You see it in the post-World War II era, where the needs were different and changing. And the policy decisions that were made and the investments that were made in each of those two eras drove unbelievable periods of American prosperity and productivity. We are in one of these moments right now, where we have this unique window of opportunity where the needs are changing faster than anyone expected. The way our institutions are engineered, the policies, the finance systems don't align very well with what those needs are. And so we have this urgency of the moment. The thing that most keeps me up at night is that we would miss this moment, that we would miss this opportunity for us to retool, to re-envision the kinds of credentials, the way we organize our institutions, the way we engage students, the way we engage employers, even in the design of these programs, right? This is a time where we need to clear regulatory brush, we need to get behind the innovators, and we need to commit ourselves to impact at scale, to serve many more people than we've ever served before, to educate many more people to higher standards with more credentials than we've ever successfully achieved before. That's what's going to ensure our competitiveness in the long term. So that's the thing I most worry about, is that we won't work like we're running out of time, because we aren't.
I don't want to stop. We could keep going on that. But I do think, to this point, our agility and ability to innovate is going to be critical to that, and we need to do it at a much more agile and faster pace than we've ever done before, which means we're going to have to experiment in very different ways. Which also raises two other things we hinted at very early on, which is career navigation and career support, so that whether they're in schools or out of schools, people will be able to find those pathways and visualize those pathways in a very different way, because that's the only way that's probably going to motivate them. If they don't see a way to do that, and our economy is changing so quickly, we're going to have a real problem. And so certainly the work that you've done with Texas OnCourse and this continued commitment around career coaching, career advising, is going to be essential for that success. So I can't thank you enough, Harrison, for joining us today here in Houston. I see a snippet coming from that last thought that you shared, because I think it's truly a call to action that we're going to have to innovate differently. So as we close out, I want to thank our sponsors once again for the UpSkill Works Forum series. It's having the ability to bring Commissioner Keller here that makes it so special. And a big thank you today to today's audience for participating in person and live and allowing us to innovate a little bit here. I hope you can join us again for other conversations that are coming on some of the key workforce challenges. And I'll give you a hint of what's coming in the summer. We don't have dates yet, but we're working closely with another organization to create a green jobs report and along with the energy transition, to see what kinds of jobs are here in Houston and in Texas that we need to be thinking about, kind of the green jobs and sustainability and the energy transition. And then we'll also have an opportunity to sit down with Stephen Goldsmith, the former mayor of Indianapolis, and Kate Markham Coleman, who wrote a book called Growing Fairly, on how do you think about workforce development and equitable stuff. And in fact, several of our work here in Houston have been featured in that book. And so we'll be talking about how Houston is obviously, a work in progress to what we've been talking about, Harrison. But those will be coming in the summer. So look for those as we come up on that. And so we're excited. And once again, thank you so much for joining us today, Commissioner Keller. It has been an honor and a privilege to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.